Hello everybody and welcome to Pod in My Backyard, the pod for those of us who want to get on and solve the housing crisis. My name's Eve McQuillan, I'm a researcher and campaigner, and today, instead of homes, we're talking farming. I'm joined by the wonderful Morgan Brobyn, who writes, researches, campaigns, lobbies on issues related to the British farming sector. So Morgan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Super. So, farming, big news with impending trade wars.
Yeah.
What do you think the situation is for British farming today?
Well, it's challenging, but farming's always been challenging. There's never been a year where something hasn't happened or something's about to happen or could happen, and that's the nature of farming. Unlike other businesses or other business models, other sort of trains of professions, there's geopolitical instability, there's environmental instability, and obviously domestic politics plays a very large part in it. But I'm not going to obviously park everything on the government of the day or even the previous governments, because farming is at the mercy ultimately of nature.
Mm-hmm. Very good, thank you. I was not expecting that to end so quickly. We can edit this bit out. Super. So farming is at the mercy of nature. I think it's quite interesting that you put it that way, because we hear a lot of talk about farming and environmentalism being opposed to each other. How do you see that split?
Well, it depends. At the end of the day, we have strange bedfellows sometimes in farming. At the end of the day, our farmers do want to see high standards of welfare for our animals. Happier animals, healthier animals, better animals, and it's just something I think that's just a very human trait characteristic. You know, people look after their pets, farmers look after their animals. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rule because people are fallible, but I don't see that there's necessarily always a diametrically opposed relationship between the two. We work very closely with animal welfare NGOs on lots of issues. Like right now, we're working with them on the impending trade wars we might see with the United States. We have really high standards of animal welfare in this country. We've always gone above that of the EU when we were in the EU. Of course, we carried the standards over. We've always gold-plated them. And to be honest, most of the time, for most of the sectors, because that's another thing you have to emphasize, every sector within farming is different. Of course, you have livestock and you have arable, and they have a symbiotic relationship. You can't really have one without the other. You know, even fertilizer comes from animals, so they do work alongside each other. But I would say that one of the biggest issues that we have is the protection of our animal welfare standards. And that's, of course, going to be very relevant now in the upcoming trade negotiations, maybe ongoing with India, potentially with the United States. Obviously, the previous government tried to get FTA through, didn't quite work out, and we have one that's just been struck with Mexico, and that's the nature of the beast now, because we're outside the European Union. So I don't see that we have necessarily adversarial relationship. I like to think that we keep each other in check.
Okay.
Okay,
that's good to know. Thank you for that. So you're talking about trade with the US potentially now, the thing that we've all been hearing about for the last 3 years, chlorinated chicken. Tell me more about that.
Right. Well, there's a range of opinions on this. Of course, I think Nigel Farage only the other day came out and said, I don't see a problem with it. And he made a comparison between salads that are washed in supermarkets.
Don't like Nigel on the podcast, guys.
No, of course. And, your listeners will appreciate this because, I think most farmers and, all farmers and the majority of MPs and even perhaps some of his own sort of winced at that comment, because there's no comparison between a salad that's been washed, in a food manufacturing plant to the use of chlorine on farm. The reason why they use that on farm in the United States is because their standards are so low. Yeah. And it's not just a saving time sort of kind of procedure that we're worried about, because obviously they actually have mega farms. We don't really have anything in the UK, or to the best of my knowledge, in Europe that would qualify as a mega farm. I know that term is thrown around quite a lot. We might touch on that a little bit later. But there is substantial evidence to show that the use of chlorine at the beginning of the food chain on farm, when it goes through the food processing sort of manufacturing process, that increases antimicrobial resistance. So it actually makes the food more vulnerable to foodborne diseases. But it's used as a cost-efficient method there in order to just churn out lots of, quite frankly, low welfare produce.
Yeah. And then the impact of that on antibiotic resistance, etc., on the big international concerns, really.
Yeah.
I guess that brings me on to how the British government is supporting the British farming sector. If we're seeing trade negotiations where British businesses are competing against less ethical producers, what's the policy environment at the moment, and what could the policy environment be so that actually the British government is putting in place things that drive up standards rather than pull them down?
Well, I think there's a lot of good rhetoric. And this came from the previous government, from the Tory government. There's a lot of good rhetoric. Now, who's to say that the previous government might not have followed that through?
No one would say that.
No one would say that on this podcast, I guess. But we're hearing that rhetoric again. But we're not seeing the legislation being developed in Parliament that would protect those standards when it comes to just general, obviously, trade between our countries, between different countries, imports, and we can use things like GATT rules. It allows us to discriminate on those grounds, to keep low animal welfare products that are illegal to produce in this country out of this country, because it's just.
What's the GATT rule, just for people listening in?
So these are part of the World Trade Organization rules that govern obviously how trade is, how trade agreements, what you can discriminate on and what you can discriminate against, because then that ties into sort of competition laws and international competition law. So there's certain things you can put into FTAs and there's certain things you can't, or there's certain things you could try, but then they're subject to legal challenge. And there's no legal impediments that prevents us from doing this, from saying, we have a system of production here. Let's take, for example, barren battery cages for eggs. We still have cage production in this country. Most retailers don't sell caged eggs. Some of the budget ones do, and you might find them in some corner shops. But they were replaced with what were called enhanced colony cages. So these are basically just slightly bigger cages with more enrichments, and that's your sort of lowest common denominator economically. Where the European Union actually developed this legislation, and we carried it over, it's called the Laying Hen Welfare Act. But there's no other part of the world that has this legislation. So what you could have is a situation where the United States would have a mega farm where it produced barren battery caged eggs. It could take not the eggs, not the shell eggs, they're not going to go across the Atlantic on a boat and end up on our supermarkets, but they could be put into our food products, finished products like pasties, cakes, paste. There's thousands of them. Yeah. And then that also makes the whole free market argument redundant, because if you're a consumer and you make an informed choice, you go to a supermarket and you go, right, I'm going to buy free range, I'm going to buy this because it's a high. You're never going to see that. It's not going to be on the label. And retailers, because they're under pressure with rising input costs and keeping food prices down, we don't really have 100% confidence that all the retailers and all the food manufacturers out there are not going to just put products that are illegal to produce here into our foods. If it's illegal to produce here, it should be illegal to import. And we want to see a commitment from the government to put that into legislation. That would help a lot, and that could go across the board, not just with eggs, with any system, like sow stalls in the pig sector, for example. They were outlawed. So we just need to have that actually in law. We need to see it happen, and we're not seeing it happen quite yet.
Okay, so a legislative, let's edit that bit out, legislative level playing field.
Yeah, absolutely. Our farm, we're not against competition. We're not against, for example, Hellmann's. They use Dutch eggs.
Okay.
That's fine. Obviously, well, I have to be careful in representing British farming, but that's fine to make that choice as a consumer, because those systems of production, they're the same that we use here. They're not outlawed. Yeah. You can't just tie farmers' one hand behind their back and expect them to win in a fair fight against the country that's allowed to against countries that are allowed to utilize systems that are illegal here. And what effectively we're doing then is just outsourcing our animal welfare concerns. We're saying it's okay for other countries to treat animals this way or use these systems of production, but we can't do it here. And it just seems like a huge hypocrisy, and it needs to be addressed. So we want fair trade and a level playing field.
Okay. And what about driving up British standards? So I've been reading, I do some research for this podcast. I've been reading about farmers who are wanting to improve standards and are held back by the planning system and by decisions made in British local authorities where they want to make things better and they can't because of our slow, unwieldy and perhaps ineffective planning system. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, that's very true. And that, I mean, that can apply across the board to even farm expansion, diversification, and that's obviously a very big issue and a very big part, I think, of the current Labour government's drive to look at diversifying operations on farm, you know, whether that be something like alternative to energy, you know, taking manure rather and using that for biofuel, or even potentially use of some solar panels on some farms or some land, or even things like a little farm shop. He tried to get that farm shop, you know, he tried to get permission, and it met all the sort of reasonable criteria that you expect any residents to have. And they literally just turned it down because they just said, oh, well, you're too famous, it'll attract too many people. What, so it'll attract too many people paying... Too many customers. Paying tax, paying business rates to that county.
It's not a planning consideration.
Well, yeah, but they can use things like that. I mean, you see it with housing, where someone will say, oh, it'll devalue my home if more homes go up in the area. This happens with farm operations all the time. And it can really impact not just potential diversification of farm, but just the day-to-day welfare, even to get things like if a shed is damaged in a storm, you need planning permission very often to repair that.
Okay.
It's bizarre. And
to return something to the state it was already in?
Very often, not always, but very often, yeah.
Okay, that sounds quite bonkers to me. And I guess it brings me onto the kind of tension, if you like, with there's a very kind of romantic desire about preserving the countryside, preserving nature, preserving views, for something to be visited and enjoyed, but how that sits against the tension that a lot of the countryside includes industry, the farming industry, other industries, and of course we've now got increasing pressures, quite rightly, for renewable energy, increasing infrastructure pressures as well. How do you see that whole system working together? How's it not working now, and what would you like to see?
Well, we could take, for example, a byproduct of farming, you know, manure. Or slurry, as it's sometimes referred to. That needs to be stored on farm in a building. You know, it needs to be up to all the environmental codes. It needs to make sure it's hard standing, doesn't leak, doesn't permeate into the ground, and all the rest of it. And that might touch on nutrient neutrality and the rest of it. Great. But then, as the farm operation develops, and perhaps the size of the livestock gets larger, and you get more animals, you're going to get more manure. You have to apply for planning permission to store that. And it's,
what do you do if you don't get your planning permission? What do you do with your poo?
Well, what might some unscrupulous farmers might do, you know, you need to get rid of it somehow. So you can either sell it, or it doesn't get stored in a building that's secure and up to code, because that can happen, you know, because they can't get the planning permission. These farmers don't have the access to hundreds of thousands of pounds to pay for environmental group sort of funded sort of lawyers to fight planning cases against. They don't have that. They have a farm to run, and they have workers, and they have families as well. So they don't have that at this disposal. But then you can just whip up this kind of fear, because you do get a few bad eggs, pardon the pun, you know, and that causes a reputational damage for the entire industry. The majority of our industry is extremely responsible when it comes to this. But this is a resource, this manure. It can be used for biofuel. It's also used to keep the land fertile if it's applied properly and responsibly in line with what are called the farming rules for water, which some of those rules could do with a little bit of a rejig. It's a resource, and it's recently been classed in the High Court as a waste product. But that's like calling a tulip, if it's in a rose field, a weed. Okay. It's a valuable resource, and that can be used for, say, energy. You know, alternative energy uses like biofuel. Farmers would love to do things like that. If they have a surplus of manure, they'd love to be able to store it and sell it to a biofuel company. Okay. They can't do that, because they know that they'll fight one hell of a legal challenge most of the time when it comes to planning permission.
And what is it that is holding that back? Is that genuinely can't manage it well in terms of environmental impacts and pollution? Is it NIMBYism? Is it concerns about flooding? What is the issue there?
I think it's a mix of all three of those. But I would say that if you address one of the problems being the planning system, the other two problems will, I wouldn't say self-correct, but will begin to sort of perhaps, sort of dissipate to an extent, because you need to have a planning system that allows farmers to actually construct the structures they need, diversify in the way they can and they want to. And the process is extremely expensive, extremely slow, and extremely costly. And NIMBYism does play a huge part in that. I mean, if you go by, like you said, the farm, the countries, I'd say that our land in this country, there's no square meter of it that's not touched at some point by the feet of a human. We're not Latin America. We're not Latin America. We're not sort of out of Mongolia where there's just thousands of sort of kilometers of land which is just untouched. Every part of our natural environment has had some kind of interaction with humans, whether that's a nature reserve, a wildlife park, a farm, anything like that. So farmers are custodians of the environment, of wildlife, of the land. They don't just produce food. So you need to be able to create that planning structure that allows them to do that. But if you say buy an idyllic cottage out in the countryside, well, guess what? It's a working environment. People live there and work and have worked there for generations. You're going to have farms. You can have smells. You can have noises. And it just seems that politicians of all parties, they're all as bad as each other when it comes to this, acquiesce to, NIMBYism. And I know that some people say that that's reductive, but it's true. It's exactly what it is, because I've literally seen people say, not in my backyard, and they put that on planning application objections. And it's given as much weight as the economic arguments and the business case that the farmers put forward. And it's a madness that has to change.
Okay. And so would you see a way through this? What kind of policy change would you like to see that would see a way through this, that would see us, balancing the environmental obligations, reducing pollution, etc., etc.? Because we know, I think all of our rivers in this country are now polluted, which is pretty grim. Is there a way through this where it's actually a system that works for farmers, works for the environment, but doesn't work for people who just want to say, oh, not near me, because I've got something great that I want to conserve and I want to stop everybody else having a vibrant rural economy?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to our water systems, that's, we can't not mention the water companies as well in all of this. As you see, when they were up in front of the EFRA committee just a few months ago, they were dragged over the coals in regards to paying out huge fat bonuses for not even for underperforming on the environmental targets. CEOs all on well over six-figure salaries in some of the worst performing water companies. I'm not going to go for the names of them, but we perhaps know who they are. You can just Google who they are. And, and house builders, farmers, they all contribute. They all leave a footprint in terms of obviously what they do in the operations. And we need to be able to mitigate that, because it's not like it has to be a binary choice. We all need to produce food and we all need places to live. And sometimes they end up side by side. I think that the solution is quite similar to what, for example, the YIMBY Initiative are working on, in regards to a Brownfield Planning Passport.
Okay.
I think there should be something along the lines of a agricultural planning passport that could be developed. That if all the caveats and all the rules and all the environmental restrictions, requirements probably not a good word, requirement, put into the framework. And if there's certain farm operations or certain farmers are able to meet all these requirements, that can get signed off by a government department, rather than having to go through the bottom sort of planning process all the way up to the top, where it ends up going to appeal by the Secretary of State. We need to be able to expedite the process, have clarity, and I think if there's clarity, farmers can work to that, because farmers already have to create business cases and for their farms. It's not like these are variables that are manageable. Weather, biosecurity threats, bird flu, for example. You can't really put that into a plan. And then when you put planning permission on it, you have to factor into the fact that you might want to build a poultry unit. It could take you 3-4 years because of various appeals and objections. That's just not sustainable. And I think that we could develop something like this, and dare I say it, if it's taking some of the involvement of local authorities out of it, I'm just going to put my knuckle on and say, do that.
Okay, wow, big talk there. We're coming to the end now. So I guess, and you may have just answered this question, but if you were PM for the day, Morgan, what would your one policy change be?
Oh God. Oh, you PM for the day. Wow. I mean, in regards to farming, I mean, yeah, I think that it would be a commitment right now to, in terms of international trade, to ensure that our farm animal welfare standards are enshrined in law when it comes to international trade agreements. Because all the other issues we've spoken about, planning, the environment, availability of labour, getting young people into farming, because it's not just an availability of labour crisis when it comes to, say, migrational labour. You need to have generational farmers coming through. And at the moment, we are seeing a brain drain of that. I would like to see farming, actually, this is quite a positive one, I'd like to see in schools at primary level. I'd like to see kids learn about how food is produced, where it comes from, what the impact is on the environment, what we get out of it, and I'd like to see a new generation of farmers come through. I'd like to attract people from potentially the non-traditional backgrounds into farming, because it's a great way of life. Not for everybody, it's not for me, I'm not a farmer, I'm a lobbyist, but I appreciate it, and I think that would create a very positive culture for the future. We need to get young people into farming. I'd like to see it taught in schools because there's just so much ignorance around it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for joining me today, Morgan, and thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you.
Cheers.